Меня зовут Виктория. Я проектный менеджер второй фазы Дарья Скаффолд. И от имени команды Дарья Скаффолд хотела бы поблагодарить вас за то, что присоединились к сегодняшнему вебинару. И давайте, пока мы ждем всех остальных коллег и дадим возможность им присоединиться, позвольте пока пройти по основным техническим моментам сегодняшней сессии. Хотелось бы в первую очередь отметить, что наш сегодняшний вебинар записывается. Мы хотим разместить запись для тех, кто сегодня не будет иметь возможности подключиться и быть с нами онлайн. В связи с чем, если вы не хотите, чтобы ваше видео попало на запись, большая просьба вам отключить вашу камеру. Также хочу попросить вас выключить микрофоны во время основной содержательной части нашего сегодняшнего вебинара, для того, чтобы все участники смогли прослушать вебинар максимально качественно. Далее наш сегодняшний вебинар проводится нашим экспертом Хейзел Исраэл на английском языке, в связи с чем с нами сегодня наш переводчик. Поэтому, когда начнется основная содержательная часть вебинара, большая просьба в нижней панели вашего экрана найти и выбрать функцию перевода и выбрать канал перевода с английского на русский. И последнее, в случае, если будут возникать какие-либо технические проблемы, вам не будет видно экран, либо не будет звука, большая просьба, напишите нам в чат, чтобы мы смогли своевременно отреагировать и помочь вам. Теперь позвольте начать вебинар и посвятить буквально пару минут контексту, в рамках которого проходит наша с вами работа. Итак, кратко о Дарье Скаффолд. Дарья Скаффолд – это часть инициативы Европейского союза под названием «Дарья». Расшифровывается она как «Диалог и действия для находчивой молодежи Центральной Азии», и реализует ее Европейский фонд образования в сотрудничестве с национальными органами 5 республик Центральной Азии, которые отвечают за образование и развитие профессиональных навыков. В свою очередь, наша команда Дарья Скаффолд, мы стремимся создать долгосрочное улучшение в качестве профессионального образования и обучения в Центральной Азии посредством компетентного подхода, да, и мы помогаем реализовывать данную задачу посредством инструмента Scaffold. И мы очень рады, что все больше педагогов в регионе применяют данный инструмент в своей работе на ежедневной основе. Помимо создания образовательных мероприятий, целью нашей команды также является создание построения живого профессионального сообщества педагогов по всей Центральной Азии. Это сообщество, где вы можете поделиться своим опытом, научиться у коллег, да, также задавать вопросы, делиться своими достижениями в рамках использования инструмента Scaffold. И для этого у нас создано два пространства. Первое пространство – это телеграм-сообщество Дарья Scaffold. Там сейчас уже свыше 900 педагогов из 5 стран. И как раз-таки это место, где вы можете обмениваться идеями, задавать вопросы, рассказывать о своих практиках и также делиться своими достижениями. Если также после вебинара у вас появятся мысли, комментарии относительно сегодняшнего вебинара, мы будем очень рады, если вы поделитесь ими именно в данном пространстве. И второй ресурс – это мини-сайт Дарья Scaffold. Это наша такая большая объемная библиотека ресурсов, который включает в себя и практические материалы, и вдохновляющие примеры со всего региона, полезные ссылки, календарь будущих мероприятий, а также записи и материалы всех прошедших мероприятий. Сейчас для вашего удобства ссылки на данные ресурсы размещены в чате, поэтому большая просьба сохранить и воспользоваться ими, когда у вас будет время. Теперь позвольте перейти непосредственно к серии наших сегодняшних вебинаров. Сегодняшний у нас вебинар является завершающим в серии вебинаров по профессиональному развитию педагогов. В недавнем времени в Алматы прошло очное мероприятие по данной тематике, и наша команда во главе с нашим сегодняшним экспертом имела честь провести данное мероприятие. Мы также очень рады отдельно поприветствовать тех из вас, с кем мы смогли познакомиться и пообщаться воочию в его рамках. Как вы видите, сегодня у нас 6-я сессия «Голоса практиков. Обмен эффективными практиками Scaffold». И можно будет, пожалуйста, следующий слайд. Сегодняшняя сессия у нас пройдет в рамках нашего обычного формата в данных сессиях, да, то есть у нас вебинар продлится 60 минут, и мы ответим посредством вебинара на вопросы, которые у вас сейчас указаны на слайде. И в конце сессии у вас будет возможность задать вопросы, да, поделиться своими впечатлениями, поэтому большая просьба запастись терпением и как раз-таки воспользоваться этой возможностью именно в конце вебинара. Теперь позвольте безотлагательно передать слово нашему сегодняшнему эксперту. Хейзел, over to you.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. It's so lovely to see you here. Special hello to you. Thank you for joining today. Could you please just type in the chat hello and which country you are dialing in from today? Has everybody got access to the chat? Okay. Hello, lovely to see you. Yes, great, thank you. So, hello, yes, from Uzbekistan and from Tajikistan. Excellent, welcome. You're very, very welcome. It's lovely to see you here. Thank you for giving up some of your precious time to join us here today. So, as Victoria said, my name is Hazel, and today we're going to spend 60 minutes on something that I think is one of the most underestimated parts of professional development and learning, and that is the act of sharing. Sharing what you already know and what you have already tried. So I want to start with a small observation. In most education systems across Central Asia, and honestly across the world, teachers and trainers spend enormous energy preparing lessons, designing activities, and reflecting on what's worked, what needs to be improved, what impact our planning has on our learners and trainees. So we all work very, very hard at this. But then that knowledge stays in the classroom. It stays in one teacher's head. It does not travel, it does not reach the colleague in the next room, and it definitely doesn't reach the teacher in a college 300 kilometers away. So today we are going to look at why that matters, why is that important, what we can do about it, and most practically, how you can start to change that in your own context without a large budget, with not much money, without a formal platform, and without a lot of extra time. So this webinar is part of the Scaffold program. And if you have already been working with Scaffold in your institution, today is about the final phase of that cycle, if you like, the sharing phase. And if you're newer to Scaffold, don't worry, everything we cover today will make sense on its own. So let's begin. If we could move to the aims slide, please, Victoria. So here are the 3 things that I want you to take away from today. First, I want you to understand why you're sharing your practice matters, not just as a nice idea, but as something that genuinely changes how professional learning works across a school, across a college, or a region, or even across a whole country system. Second, I want to give you some very practical, simple methods for sharing, because I know that the biggest barrier to sharing is usually not motivation. It's not knowing where to start or feeling that what you have done is not big enough to share. And third, I want you to leave with one concrete next step. Just one thing you could do over the next, I don't know, 2 weeks. So something very simple, something very easy, something very concrete. So today's theme sits in the scaffold cycle at the sharing phase. And I want to explain what I mean by that before we go any further. The scaffold approach is built around a continuous loop. You plan an activity, you implement that activity, you evaluate what happened, you do a bit of research to deepen your understanding, and then, and this is the part we are focusing on today, you share what you have found. And then the cycle begins again. Most of us do the first 4 steps reasonably well, but the sharing step is the one that tends to get left out. And that is exactly the gap we are addressing today. Could we move on to the third slide? Well, my third slide, please, Victoria. Thank you. So why sharing matters then? Let me give you a concrete picture or example of why sharing is so important. Imagine a trainer at a technical college in Almaty. She has been working with the scaffold planning cards for about 3 months. And she tries the inquiry card, the one that asks learners to investigate a real-world problem rather than just answer textbook questions. It does not go perfectly the first time, but by the third attempt, something shifts, something begins to change. Her learners start asking questions she has not been asked before. They start disagreeing with each other in a good way because they have done their own research and they have different answers. She finds that even her quietest students are contributing because the question is open enough that there is no single correct answer. She writes a few notes to herself, she adjusts the task for the next group, and then she moves on to the next unit. She never tells anyone what she found out. Now, that institution has perhaps 40 trainers. If even 10 of them had similar moments with scaffold activities, things like small breakthroughs, things that genuinely changed the energy in the room, and none of them have shared those moments, then the institution has lost 40 moments of learning. It has had to relearn the same lesson 40 separate times. And that is the cost of not sharing. And I think this happens everywhere. It is not a Central Asian problem or an education problem, really. It is a human problem. We tend to share when things go very well or when things go very badly. The middle ground, those quiet successes, the small adjustments that made a real difference, those unfortunately tend to disappear. Now then, think about the opposite. Think about a school in Bishkek or Tashkent, where two teachers who work with the same learner group have a 15-minute conversation every Friday afternoon. Now, this is not a formal meeting, it's not a written report, it's just a conversation, a quick dialogue. What did you try this week and what happened? Is the question that they look to answer in this discussion, and that is all. Research on teacher professional learning, including work done in the OECD TALIS studies, consistently shows that this kind of informal, regular, peer-to-peer exchange is one of the most powerful drivers of improved teaching practice. It is more effective in many contexts than formal training days. So never underestimate the value of those incidental, informal, sometimes very brief conversations that we have with colleagues over a cup of coffee at the end of the day when we're just sitting in the staff room. So when we share, we multiply impact. One person's insight, one person's experience becomes a resource for 10 people. Also, when we share, we build community. Sharing creates relationships. It gives people a reason to talk across departments, across institutions, across regions, across countries, cross-country systems. Also, when we share, we create consistency. So when everyone is learning in isolation, practice inside the same institution can vary enormously. Sharing helps align approaches without imposing a single rigid method. So we know there are pockets of excellent practice, pockets of good practice, pockets of less confident practice. And when we share to create consistency, we can learn from each other and raise the quality of practice across whole institutions. Also, when we share, we inspire innovation. We build confidence to experiment with new approaches. So when you hear what a colleague tried, even if it is completely different from your own subject area, it can spark ideas. And this is how new approaches get invented. Not in isolation, always, but in conversation. That inspiration can build confidence for colleagues to have a go, to give things a try. Now, I want you to think about your own context for a moment. I suspect that most of you are in institutions where there is good practice happening, where colleagues are trying things, learning things, adjusting their practice in response to their findings. The question is not whether that knowledge exists. The question is whether that knowledge travels beyond that individual practitioner, that individual educator or classroom. If we could have the next slide, please, Victoria. So what counts as effective practice then? Often teachers can be very humble and they can think, oh, I'm not doing anything that's world leading, or, my practice is not outstanding. It's not necessarily any better than somebody else's practice. But never underestimate that, because you will not know unless you share. And it's not about thinking that we are the best or thinking we are the worst. We are always learning. We are always looking to improve. We can always find better ways to do things. We're always learning about our learners, the people in front of us, about our subject areas. Knowledge changes and grows all the time. So Before we can talk about how to share, then, we need to be clear about what is worth sharing. And this is where I see a lot of people get stuck, because there is a common assumption that you can only share something if it was a polished success, if it looked impressive, if you have data to back it up, if you have reams of research, if you have a lot of research to back up what you've done. And this is not the case. This is not what I mean by effective practice for today, and it is not what scaffold means by it either. An effective scaffold-based practice has 3 characteristics. So let me go through each one. Firstly, then, it links to one or more key competences. Scaffold as a tool exists to help us to deliver competence-based learning successfully. So very often in the training, we focus on the principles, the pedagogical principles, or we focus on teaching methods and assessment methods and the planning protocol in the planning and settings cards. But really, those exist to help us to develop those key competence frameworks: DigComp, EntreComp, LifeComp, and GreenComp. So effective practice then will be looking to develop one of those key competences from those frameworks, one or more. This doesn't mean that you need to have written up a competence framework before sharing. It just means that what you did had a learning purpose beyond content delivery. For example, a trainer in a vocational college who asks learners to work in pairs, to teach each other a procedure, rather than just watch the trainer demonstrate it, is working with collaboration and learner-led learning. Now, those are competences. That is scaffold-aligned practice, and it does not need to be labelled formally to be worth sharing. Your experiments with the competence frameworks and the competences that sit within are worth sharing, whether it goes very, very well and you're like, hooray, all my students gained this competence, fantastic, or whether it was a disaster. There is professional learning available to you and to your colleagues drawn from that experience. Okay, so secondly then, the practice encourages learner autonomy, creativity, or reflection. So think about the difference between a task where learners follow a sequence of steps and a task where learners have to make a choice about how to approach something, about which option is better, about how they would explain it to someone else. The second type of task develops the learner. It is the second type that tends to produce those moments I described earlier. The unexpected question, the learner who was previously disengaged, suddenly leaning in and making active and positive contributions to the class. So I worked with a trainer in a professional development context, not unlike yours, who introduced a very simple change. At the end of each lesson, instead of summarizing the lesson himself, he asked a different learner each time at the end of each lesson to give a 1-minute summary. So that's it. It's as simple as that. No technology, no resources, no extra preparation. But what it did was force every learner to pay attention throughout the session, because any of them might be asked at the end of the session to provide that 1-minute summary. Now, this approach, beautiful in its simplicity, it gave the trainer immediate information about what learners had actually understood versus what they thought they had understood. Now, that is effective practice. It's small, it is simple, and it is absolutely worth sharing. So thirdly, then finally, the practice shows some observable change in learning or engagement. So this does not mean you need a controlled experiment with a control group. It doesn't need to be highly scientific or complex. It can simply mean that you have noticed something. Attendance has improved. Learners started staying behind to continue a discussion. Written work showed more independent thinking. A learner who has been disengaged for months completed a task voluntarily. These are all signals, and they are proof of causation, is what we call it. But they are evidence that something shifted, and that is enough to make an experience worth sharing. And at that point, it can be very valuable for you to gain insight and feedback from your colleagues. That when you are sharing these small changes that you have noticed, your colleagues may well have something very valuable to contribute to that discussion as well. So I want to give you one more example from a Central Asian context, because I think it brings this to life very directly. So in a teacher training program in Uzbekistan, working with teachers who were learning to teach in a more learner-centered way, one of the trainers introduced a self-reflection card at the end of each session. So learners wrote 3 things. One thing they understood, one thing they were still uncertain about, and one question they wanted answered next time. So the trainer then used these cards to plan the following session. And within 3 weeks, she noticed that her planning time had actually reduced because she was no longer guessing what the group needed. She knew because she had asked them. And learner confidence in asking questions openly had measurably increased because they had been practicing the habit of articulating uncertainty in a low stakes written format. They didn't feel that they were exposing themselves to other people. It was just a quick, quiet, confidential note between them and the teacher. And the teacher doesn't necessarily even need to know the names of the feedback necessarily, because if the teacher is focusing on using this for planning the next session, the messaging is still there. What's been gained, what still needs development, questions that remain to be answered. And so this again is a story worth sharing. It is practical, it is transferable, and it happened in this region in a context that will feel familiar to many of you. Could we move on to the next slide, please, Victoria? So, how to share them? We've got a slide here with some suggestions, some very easy, low cost, low effort examples of sharing. So this is the practical part of the webinar today. Then what do you do? How do you actually share? I mean, I've mentioned incidental conversations in the corridor or in the staff room, but I want to go through the methods on this slide one by one, because I think each of them deserves a real example, not just a label. So to start off with, then we'll look at peer discussions. And this is the simplest starting point, a conversation with a colleague. Ideally, someone who teaches or trains in a similar context to you, but does not necessarily teach the same subject or even the same groups. The conversation does not need to be long. 10 minutes is enough if it is focused. And I think the key to successful peer discussions is to have a specific prompt. Tell me about something you tried recently that you were not sure about as a question is a better prompt than how is it going? You know, how is it going is good in the sense that it's open-ended, but it can be too wide-ranging. If we use the very specific example I just gave you, that is, tell me about something you tried recently that you were not sure about. This invites a real answer, an authentic problem that was overcome, perhaps, how confidence was built through this experience. In some institutions I have worked with, these conversations happen over coffee, in corridors, on the way to the car park. They are not scheduled, they're not timetabled, and that is fine. They are still important. They can still make a difference. They can still lead to that professional learning. The upgrade is to make them slightly more intentional. Perhaps asking the same question every time. What did you try and what did you notice? So always there is that focus on the impact. What changes occurred as a result of this experimentation, then trying something new? Peer discussions. So let's move on then to learning circles. So this is a small group, say 4 to 8 people, who meet regularly to discuss their practice. Now, the key word here is regularly. Once a month is often enough. The meeting does not need to be long. 30 to 45 minutes can work very well. The format is simple in that each person shares one experience from the previous month. The group asks questions and the discussion naturally draws out transferable lessons. I know of a learning circle that was formed among school directors in Kazakhstan. It was not formally organized by anyone. It was just 6 people who decided to meet on the first Monday of each month to talk about what was working and what was not in their institutions. There was no agenda, no minutes, no hierarchy. After a year, several of them had adopted practices from each other's schools, and that is professional learning at its most organic and, frankly, at its most effective. That ongoing, regular, focused, simple format called learning circles. I hope that you can recognize that these methods are very easy to try, really easy to have a go with in your own institutions. So another method then is to the showcase events. Now, these are slightly more visible. A showcase might be an afternoon session where 3 or 4 colleagues each spend 10 minutes presenting something they have tried. It can be a small display or a set of learner work that illustrates a scaffold activity, one method, one competence. It does not need to be polished. It does not need to be perfect. In fact, often it can be more useful to share real rough examples of things, you know, because the purpose of the showcase event is not to show off something fantastic, it's to make good practice visible and to take that good practice out of the classroom and into the shared space of the institution. I want to note something important here, because in some cultural contexts, there is a genuine hesitation about presenting yourself as having done something well. it can feel like boasting or showing off, you know? And I understand that hesitation. One way around it is to frame the showcase not as, look what I did, pat on the back for me. It's not about what we did as teachers. The focus of the sharing and the showcase is, look what my learners produced. Look what my learners have done. So focus that sharing on the impact on learners, because this is often the key question in any new initiative or teaching. The whole point of teaching is to have that impact on learners. So it's a difficult question to answer, can be the killer question, but it is the most important. And when we focus this sharing and showcase on, look what my learners produced, the learner's work does the speaking. You are simply making it available for others to see. Okay, our next method of sharing then is about online posts or mini case studies. Now, many of you will be members of our Telegram group, and you will notice on there that there are lots of examples of sharing, reflections, photographs, learning designs. There is a wealth of information there, which teachers in those groups have very generously shared with each other. And when we do online posts or mini case studies like that to share, we want something very small and digestible, not only because it takes less time to create, but also because it takes less time to consume, takes less time to watch or to read. So that sharing can reach a greater number within a very busy audience. So these online posts then, or mini case studies, I urge you to visit Telegram and have a look, revisit those examples from the perspective of sharing experience. So those posts can be a single paragraph, it can be a photograph of learner work with a 2-sentence caption, it can be a short voice note, maybe in a WhatsApp group if you have a local group within your institution. And these are all forms of sharing. They do not require a formal platform. Many of you will already have professional communication channels like our Telegram group or a WhatsApp group or an institutional forum. The question is whether those channels are being used for professional learning or just for logistics and operational issues. One post a month describing something that you have tried can be enough to shift the culture, to refocus that sharing on what changes for learners, what is the impact of these different scaffold methods and competences that we are using. Finally, then, there is mentoring pairs. Now, this is perhaps the most powerful of all the methods and the one that produces the deepest learning for both people, not just the one being mentored. A mentoring pair meets regularly, so perhaps every 2 weeks, and again uses a very simple structure. The mentee describes what they are working on, and the mentor asks questions rather than giving advice, and both reflect on what they have heard. So if you have the opportunity to set up or participate in a mentoring pair in your institution, I would strongly encourage it. In our recent event in Almaty, much of the work over the 3 days, I think probably 2.5 days of the 3 days, delegates were working in mixed country groups, and it was phenomenal. It was really fantastic to see educators and trainers sharing practice, sharing ideas across internationally, really transnational sharing. It was fantastic and really inspiring. And one of the methods we suggested as a way to build on and to continue the value and benefit of this experience was for people to, what we called buddy up. So it's like find a partner, find a buddy or a friend from another country in your group who you can stay in touch with. So delegates were sharing email addresses so that they could have buddies from other countries, really, who they could call on to do this sharing, really, in very simple ways. Have you tried this? Have you got something for? How did this go for you? What do you think of this idea? Very simple sharing, support, encouragement. And also, so the mentor does not need to be an expert necessarily. It's two colleagues coming together to support, share, and inspire each other. So I would really encourage this as a very effective method for sharing. Now, you might be looking at this list of 5 ways to share practice, and you might be thinking that your institution does not have the culture for any of these things, that there is not the time, there is not the structure, there's not the appetite. And I would say 2 things to that. First of all, none of these 5 things on the slide require permission from your institution. You could start a peer conversation tomorrow. You don't need a policy for it. Secondly, culture is changed by behaviours, not by decisions. So if you start sharing, even quietly, even in a small way, you are modelling something. You're showing this desirable practice. And modelling is how culture shifts. That's how you can really change things in your institutions. Could we go to the next slide, please? So let's take a step back for a moment and put sharing into the bigger picture of the scaffold cycle. So the scaffold cycle then has these 5 phases: plan, implement, evaluate, research, and share. And then it loops. That slide is a bit misleading in the sense that it shows it as one linear sequence, when really it should be part of that ongoing loop, if you like. And this is because after sharing, you begin planning again, but with richer knowledge than you had before. So most professional development programs focus heavily on the first 2 phases, planning and implementing. They tend to give you tools, frameworks, and techniques, and they ask you to try them. Some also pay serious attention to evaluation, asking you to reflect on what happened and why it happened. Fewer invest in that research phase where you step back and look at what the evidence says more broadly. But sharing is the phase that is most consistently under-resourced. And it is the one that turns individual learning into collective learning. Without sharing, every teacher and trainer is essentially running a private experiment. They learn something, but that learning stays with them. When we share, with sharing, that experiment becomes a shared resource. The learning belongs to the community of educators. So there is a concept in organizational learning, and it's big in higher education and universities, called knowledge transfer. The idea that knowledge has to be actively moved from one person to another person, because it does not transfer automatically just because people are in the same building. So there's a book called The Knowledge Creating Company, Nonaka and Takeuchi, 1995, who came up with this idea first of all. Sharing is the mechanism for knowledge transfer. So it is the bridge between what one person knows and what an institution knows. So let me give you a concrete example of how this plays out. So imagine a trainer in a technical college in Dushanbe who uses one of the scaffold planning cards, let's say the reflection card, and discovers that when she gives learners a structured reflection prompt at the end of a practical session, they are significantly better at identifying their own errors during the next session. They arrive better prepared, they ask more specific questions. She has discovered something genuinely useful about how reflection transfers into improved performance. Now, if she keeps that to herself, the institution does not benefit. If she mentions it to a colleague, one colleague benefits. If she brings it to a learning circle or a short team meeting, the whole department can try it. And if she writes a short paragraph about it and shares it with her regional network, trainers across the country can try it in their contexts, adapting it, improving it, feeding back what they have found. Now, that is the scaffold sharing phase in action. It's not grand, it's not time consuming, but it is genuinely powerful. Okay, if we could move to the next slide, please, Victoria. So I want to pause here for a moment for a short reflection. Think about your practice over the last few months. Think about one activity or approach you tried with your learners rather. Something that you felt made a difference, even a small one. It does not have to be perfect, just needs to be real. Ask yourself, what went well, even partially? What could a colleague learn from it? And who is one person you could share it with first? So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to think about that. What went well? What could a colleague learn from it? Who is one person you could share it with first? What went well? What could a colleague learn from it? Who is one person you could share it with first? Okay, just hold those thoughts for a moment. I am going to come back to this in the final few minutes when we talk about your next step, okay? If we could move to the next slide, please, Victoria. So, I want to talk now about what happens when sharing becomes a habit across an institution, because it does not happen automatically, and there are things that leaders and experienced practitioners can actively do to support it. So the first thing is giving time. So this sounds obvious, but it is the most common barrier. When every meeting is full of logistics and reporting, there is no space for professional conversations. So leaders who actively protect time within those meetings, even 10 minutes at the end of a team meeting, this can send a signal that this kind of exchange matters. So protecting that time, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. We're not asking for whole days off, to attend workshops. It can be a very quick conversation. The second thing is celebrating examples, not in a performative way, not awards and certificates, although these are great. They can be great celebrations and very motivational, but that's not the purpose of sharing. Sharing is about celebrating the learning and development. Sharing in the sense of simply naming what you see. So like the example on the slide, Camilla tried something interesting with her group last week. Ask her about it. This is a form of celebration. It makes practice visible, and it also gives permission for others to try. Oh, that's brilliant. That's great. Good. Thank you. That's good to hear. And it can be as simple as that. And that sharing can save people from making the same mistakes you've made, or can give them hints and tips about how to use something well, or maybe to use an approach that they haven't tried before. Just can give people confidence to have a go, or just inspiration and a reminder. I know when I was teaching full time in a college, life is so busy. Every day is so busy. I used to see hundreds of learners every week in my classes. It's very easy to forget about sharing or about different methods or activities, So that sharing can be a reminder, very useful reminder. Third thing then is about building networks. And this is especially relevant in the Central Asian context, where institutions are sometimes geographically isolated from each other, and where regional networks can be underused for professional learning purposes. So the scaffold program is itself a kind of network, but networks need active maintenance. They need people who are willing to share across boundaries, not just within their own institutions. And I want to say something directly to those of you who may be in leadership positions, or who are CPD leads or coordinators. You have a disproportionate amount of influence over whether sharing happens in your institution. Not because you can force it, you can't, but because the things you pay attention to are the things your colleagues will pay attention to. If you ask about what people tried, they will start noticing what they tried. If you share your own practice, including your mistakes, you signal that sharing is safe. And that is not a small thing at all. That's lovely. Project work experience. That's great. Yes. Yes, yes. That's great. Love some lovely examples there in the chat. Thank you very much. Thank you. This is sharing. You see, it can be as simple as these examples here in the chat. How quick was that? But how valuable. And so, yes, in the teamwork example from Azra there as well, then just emphasizing that effective teamwork is built on trust and open exchange of ideas. That can be a really important tip for somebody who feels the need to really control conversations. So finally then, in our last slide, please, Victoria, So let me bring us back to those 3 learning outcomes I set out at the beginning, because I want to check that we've covered them. So first of all, we looked at why sharing matters, because professional learning does not scale unless it travels beyond the individual, and because the knowledge already exists in your institution. It just needs to move from one individual to another. It needs to come out of your classrooms and workshops to be shared. We also had a look at how to share. We considered a few simple methods, like peer conversations, learning circles, showcases, online posts, and mentoring pairs or buddies. None of these require a budget or formal structure. They require intention and a small amount of habit or consistency. And we looked at where sharing sits in the scaffold cycle as the bridge from individual reflection to collective learning, and as the phase that ensures the cycle actually continues rather than stopping after evaluation. So before we close, I want to return to that reflection I asked you to do a few minutes ago. You thought of one thing you tried, one thing that made a difference, even slightly. And here is your one next step. Share it with one person, okay, when you leave today's webinar, in one of the simplest ways possible over the next 2 weeks. Tell a colleague over coffee, send a message in your team group, mention it in the departmental meeting. That is all. One story, one person, got 2 weeks, or even in the Telegram group. But thank you so much for your attention today. Thank you for your time. We have a downloadable handout for you. It includes a summary of the sharing methods and the key reflection questions to use with your own teams. I really hope that this session has been useful for you and that you will take that one method and share with your colleagues and start to develop and build a culture of sharing within your own institutions. Thank you very much.
Уважаемые коллеги, спасибо большое за выделенное время. Кажется, сегодняшний вебинар такой был очень такой хорошей завершающей сессией в серии вебинаров профессионального развития педагогов. Как упоминала наша эксперт ранее, да, то есть обмен между педагогами – это самый эффективный, но при этом самый недооцененный метод, которым вы можете воспользоваться буквально бесплатно и буквально без траты какого-то вашего большого объема времени. Поэтому, пожалуйста, мы надеемся, что сегодняшняя сессия была для вас полезной. Также хотелось бы вам напомнить то, что запись сегодняшнего вебинара, также материалы и раздаточный документ, который только что был загружен в чат, будут доступны для скачивания, для просмотра вам сегодня в конце дня, либо завтра утром. Надеемся, что мы с вами встретимся еще, да, в рамках уже других наших оставшихся вебинаров. Большая просьба к вам следить за анонсами наших оставшихся сессий онлайн, да, у нас их осталось не так много на самом деле, поэтому очень надеемся, что у нас будет еще дополнительная возможность, да, с вами увидеться и обсудить насущные темы в рамках исследования потенциала инструмента Scaffold. На этом хотели бы завершить сегодняшнюю сессию и до встречи в рамках следующих вебинаров Дарья Scaffold. Спасибо всем большое.